So now that I'm pretty much running D&D exclusively online, I've been trying to think of ways to make things more interesting and things that will use that online space. Stuff that's not necessarily impossible to do on a tabletop, but stuff that's a little more difficult. Virtual tabletops, of course, are great, but I'm trying to think of encounters that really make use of that digital space. And this is the story of one of those, which is a chess encounter that I ran a couple of weeks ago for one of my adventuring parties. Quick note, if you are a player in this game, this video is going to contain a little bit of background information, nothing too spoilery in terms of story stuff, but just to warn you on that one. So when I'm planning out a session or an encounter, my first stop is usually the DND Maps subreddit, which is a very active community, and it's full of people who are just constantly posting new maps and new ideas and new concepts. And I like to browse through there just to get a bit of an idea and maybe come up with some cool encounter concepts that I wouldn't have thought of originally. So I'm preparing for this session and I come across this map, which is a creation by Reddit user known as Celtic Dungeons, representing a chessboard. I'll link their profile and also this Reddit post in the video description. I knew that my players were going to be interacting with some artifacts that were left by a wizard who specialised in planar magic. They'd be teleporting inside objects that were larger on the inside than they were on the outside, extra planar spaces, that sort of thing. And yeah, putting them inside a chess game seemed to fit that really well. So all I needed to do was to figure out how I was going to run this chess encounter using the rules of D&D to make things interesting. Now I knew that this wizard had a habit of employing extra planar creatures to do his bidding, but which were going to be the best for a chessboard? Which would fit the rules of the game the best? Of course, it would have to be the Mudrons. These are the strange, angular denizens of Mechanus. Now in the Great Wheel cosmology, Mechanus is the planar embodiment of pure law. It's a realm of clockwork and gears, with logic and order taking priority above any consideration of good or evil. The Mudrons, their structural complexity determines their position in social hierarchy, and they're capable of increasingly complex tasks the more geometric sides that they have. So the one-sided Mudron becomes the pawn in the chess game. The two-sided duodrone, slightly more complex, becomes the rook, and so on. Now this worked out fairly well until I got to working out the king and queen for the game. Now the next logical step would be to use the pentadrone, which is a five-sided creature and is the last one that is really available for easy access in terms of a combat encounter. But these are technically large creatures, and they would take up double the space of the others, which makes movement in a chessboard not work properly. In the end, I came up with something to compromise, but one that actually kind of fits my story a little better, which is to say that over time, these wizards' creations are becoming corrupted and distorted and not quite working the way that they should. So it was quite simple and made a lot of sense for the king and queen to have been somehow corrupted in the same way and become a hybrid, joining together to make one single entity that sort of has some of the abilities of both. So with the board laid out, it was time to think of mechanics. Now I had 6 characters to work with, 5 players, and then the ranger's beast companion. And yeah, pretty straightforward. 2 rooks, 2 bishops, 2 knights. I would have them pick up little badges at the start that would represent the piece that they wanted to take for this game, and make that a fairly easy and open choice so they could see exactly what was going to be happening when they made that decision. Their goal would be to take down the king-queen hybrid, retrieve the crown, and then use that to escape. But it will probably be obvious to most of you. 8 monodrones, 2 duodrones, 2 tridrones, 2 quadrones, and 1 pentadrone is, well, against 5 level 3 players, yeah, deadly. Deadly. So I spent a little bit of time trying to come up with a set of rules that would seem fair and would allow me to use this concept without just absolutely steamrolling the players and making them hate me. So I would have the players roll initiative as usual, but the Mudrons wouldn't roll at all. Instead, using something a little bit more like a lair action, the board would take a turn after every player turn. So a player would take a turn, I would then choose one of the pieces and it would take one turn, so a move and an action. And this meant that I could actually use something kind of similar to chess tactics without swamping the players with all the Mudrons moving at once or loads of different actions happening at the same time. And that kind of actually made it feel more chess-like in a way, because they were playing tactically against the board as much as I was playing tactically against them in this situation. Next, I figured I needed to fiddle with the stats and the attacks a little bit. So technically, every Mudron except the Pentadrone has a ranged attack, but I decided it would be better if only those that represented the bishop and the rook would be able to use these, because they have the longest range on a chessboard, except for the queen. Players, of course, would have to follow the same rules, with only those representing the bishop and the rook able to attack with ranged weapons, the knight being restricted to melee weapons, although this didn't actually come up in gameplay because the two characters that used the knight token were melee characters anyway, so it didn't really make a difference. I had a little bit of a debate with myself about whether I was going to allow area of effect attacks, and I decided that ultimately, yeah, I would, especially because there weren't many in this party. Like, there's nobody with a fireball, there was nobody that could just wipe out half the board in one go, so I decided that I would allow that. And then we get to the subject of death. So when an enemy piece is killed, it would be taken, and its body would appear on the back end of the friendly side of the board. In something similar to the promotion rule that you get in actual chess, if an enemy pawn made its way all the way to the end of the board, they would be able to choose one dead piece to resurrect in as close an approximation to its original spot as possible. The same rule would apply to players. So when one of the players went down, his body was transported to the wall behind enemy lines. And essentially, players then needed to either recover him or end the game before his death saving throws ran out and he actually died. So, once that was all laid out, game time. I have to say this was one of the most fun encounters that I've run recently, and the players seemed to really love it as well. It did add a lot to the atmosphere of this strange arcane world where things kind of weren't working properly, but they had to interact with those systems in order to get out and free themselves. And it definitely took a lot of work to set up, but I think it was definitely worth it, and the players seemed to agree it was a really fun encounter. This also got me thinking then about other board games that might work well translated into D&D rules. The one that springs to mind would be something like Snakes and Ladders, with players going through a linear dungeon, being chased perhaps, or encountering enemies along the way, but also having to make dexterity checks to avoid falling into portals that would either send them further through the dungeon or backwards towards the beginning. I think that could be pretty cool actually if it was worked out correctly. But I would love to hear your thoughts on my encounter as always, anything that you'd change or add, or any other weird board gamey ideas that you've got that you could transmute into something D&D-ish. That would be awesome to hear about. And I love reading your comments, so let's hear your ideas. Otherwise, you can always show support for the channel by liking it. If you want to see more stuff coming up, then why not subscribe? But otherwise, until next time, see you later.